In this video, I'm going to describe how to use parameterized SQL statements, that is, SQL statements that have placeholders for values that you can then fill in programmatically using a bit of ActionScript code. For this demonstration, I'll use an application in the Chapter 09 Begin project named Using Parameters.mxml. If you're following along in the exercises, you can open that application now. In this version of the application, we're once again creating a database in the application storage directory, that is, the directory that's unique to both this application and to the current user, and then creating the person table if it doesn't already exist. There's already a create record method that inserts literal values into the person table. Each time it's executed, we're creating a new row in the database table. There's also a function now named empty table that executes a delete statement that clears all of the data from the person table. Use this function with some care because it currently doesn't have any confirmation interface to allow the user to confirm or reject emptying the table once they call the function. Then there's a function named retrieve data that executes a select statement and saves the data into a bindable array collection named AC contacts. The user interface of the application includes a data grid to display the current data, this time only 3 columns of the data, the first name, last name, and email, and then a couple of buttons labeled retrieve data and empty table. There's also an instance of a custom form component named person form. This component has already been completed. It's a data entry form with input controls for each of the non-primary key values in the database table. When the user clicks a button to save the new data, it creates an instance of a value object class named person, passes in the values from the data entry form, and then dispatches that object inside a custom event named person event. At the application level, we then listen for that event using the save event handler, that's a custom event that's a part of the form component, and we call the create record method. I'll run the application initially, and as it starts up, it should create a new empty database table in a new database. I'll click the Save button a few times, 1, 2, and 3, and then click the Retrieve Data button, and you'll see that I'm successfully adding records with literal values. Then I'll click the Empty Table button, and I'll clear the database table. Now I'm finally ready to demonstrate the use of parameterized statements. Move to the Create Record function, which currently executes an insert statement and adds literal values. Parameterized statements can be declared in a couple of different ways, but here's the most common syntax. I'll remove the literal value and replace it with a parameter that starts with a colon and then assigns a parameter name, colon first name. And I'll do that for each of the values that I'm inserting, colon first name, colon last name, and notice that I'm simply matching the names of the columns. You don't have to do that. You can use parameters of any name you like. However, it does make it a lot easier if you simply match the parameter names to the column names. So now I have 7 parameters, each named for the column into which their data will be inserted. Notice that the order of the parameters matches the order of the columns in the first list. Now, before I execute the statement, I have to assign values to each parameter. The SQL statement class has a property named parameters, which is a generic ActionScript object. Each time you create a new parameter, you do so with associative array style syntax. Put in a pair of brackets, and inside the brackets put in a string that matches the parameter name that you're replacing with the value. So for instance, to replace the first name parameter, the syntax is stmt.parameters, then open bracket, then the name of the parameter as a string, close bracket, and then assign a value. Notice that this create record function is receiving an argument named person, which is data typed as the person value object. So I can assign the value like this, person.firstName. Notice that the use of the strongly typed person value object class makes it a lot easier to type in the property names, auto-complete those values, and make sure that you've typed them correctly. Now I'm going to clone this line of code. Remember, you can clone a line of code using either Control-Alt-Down on Windows or Command-Alt-Down on Mac. I'll end up with one line of code for each parameter I need to replace. Then I'll replace them one at a time. The last name, so I've first created the SQL statement with named parameters where I need to plug in the values. Then I set each parameter individually using the parameter name prefixed with the colon as a string. I pass that value into the parameters object using associative array style syntax, and I assign the value, in this case from the value object that was passed in as an argument. Then, just as before, I execute the method. And this time, after I've called the execute method, instead of retrieving a result, I'll simply call the existing retrieve data function, and that will result in displaying the new data in the data grid. I'll save the changes and run the application. I'll start by clicking into the form and typing in some values. You can type in whatever values you want into the form. Then I'll click the Save button to call the Create Record method, and you'll see that the data was correctly added to the local database. I'll change some values in the form. Once again, I'll click the Save method, and you'll see that I'm adding new records each time I click. So that's how we use parameterized SQL statements when working with the local SQL-like database. Just to review the steps one more time. The statement itself is constructed as a standard SQL statement. You plug in parameters using the syntax colon and then the name of the parameter you want to use. The best practice is to use a parameter name that matches the column name. Then for each parameter, you replace the parameter with a value by setting its value in the parameters object of the SQL statement. Then, as before, you execute the statement, and the result is passing in parameterized SQL statements without having to worry about concatenating all the strings together yourself.